Welcome to the Empathic Mastery Show. I'm your host, Jennifer Moore, and I'm so glad you're here. This is a place where we talk about what it means to be highly sensitive and empathic, how this impacts all aspects of our lives, and we explore tools, resources, and solutions so we can shift from absorbing all the thoughts, feelings, and energy of the world around us to being beacons for calm, love, and healing. Hi there, everybody. I'm back with a really interesting conversation today. Hopefully, it won't be too much of a bummer because we are talking about climate crisis and climate change and activism and all kinds of amazing stuff with Laura Hartley. Laura Hartley is an activist and coach helping purpose-driven individuals bridge self and systems so they can deepen their impact without the stress and burnout. Fascinated by the relationship between inner and outer change, as well as how we can reimagine our cities and economy, Laura empowers change makers with the skills of getting free, dismantling capitalism and patriarchy from the inside out. Ah, what a mouthful. She runs programs in healing burnout culture, inner leadership, and finding your way in a changing world. She originally hails from Sydney, Australia, but currently lives in Toronto, Canada. Laura, welcome. I am so glad you're here and so excited to dive into this really rich conversation.
Thank you for having me. It is an honor to be here, and I'm really excited as well.
Well, and talking about, it's interesting, there's a theme going on right now this week that I've been noticing with my clients, with my students, where we've been talking about this, like decolonizing the capitalism within ourselves. One of my dear students and mentees has COVID right now. And so we just did a bunch of work on allowing themselves to stop and rest, and how incredibly important it is, like that hustle culture that is just constantly pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And, so it just seems like everything is kind of pointing in the same direction right now for me to this idea of dismantling capitalism and dismantling patriarchy from the inside out. So I love that is so much of what you do. But before we jumped on, we turned on the recording, you and I were talking about how you identify as a highly feeling and intuitive person, but not necessarily an empath. And, I'd love to, and I was talking about my understanding or my sense of it is the distinction between these two things is that highly feeling and intuitive is still picking up a lot of information. But unlike an empath, you can recognize that it's not yours. Whereas for us as empaths, we process information as if it's our own. So like often it's like if we're picking up on the global fear about the climate, we're going to feel it as if it's our own fear. But I always love to start with like you and who you are, what your experience was like. Like, let's start at the beginning. Who were you as a kid? What was it like for you? Going into dismantling patriarchy and capitalism, that's a big thing. How'd you get there? So tell me about you. Tell me about your childhood or your teenage years or your young adulthood or whatever feels like the right place to start.
Oh, gosh. Big question, but a big question for what is a big kind of role that I've chosen to be part of in this life. I think my childhood had a big influence on the work that I do now. I was incredibly fortunate to grow up in a household that was like filled with personal development and spirituality and new age teachings. My mother was a coach. She ran one of the first life coach training schools in Australia. And so from a young age, I was very much exposed to materials that perhaps I didn't know it then because, when you're like 7 years old, the last thing you want to listen to is like Deepak Chopra in the car or something.
Right.
But that gave me an ability to recognize that we have an inner world and that we can cultivate that inner world. It gave me a love for good questions and the truth and the capacity and the transformation that good questions can bring. And that's why I do coaching now. And so my upbringing was one that was simultaneously filled with wisdom that has deeply informed what I experience today, but also wasn't necessarily easy. I spent much of my adolescence not feeling. I struggled very much with mental health issues, with depression. I was very heavily medicated for a number of years and felt like, this idea of emotions was just something that I was so detached from. And so even though I would call myself deeply feeling now, and I would call myself intuitive now, these are practices and skills and tools and spaces that I've had to learn to touch into again, that I've had to learn to reconnect with, that I'm able to deeply feel now because I spent so long not feeling. And so there's many different influences, but yes, all coming through to today.
Yeah, I'm imagining as I'm hearing you to not feel, I'm sort of imagining that was the antidote or the balance to feeling a great deal before that, especially if you were heavily medicated. So how interesting that your mother was a coach, that you were growing up in this like new age woo self-development environment. And yet the solution to, you were saying you were very depressed, the solution to the intensity of your feelings, the solution to your depression was medication. Was that something that your family decided? Was that something that you pushed for? Like that, it's just fascinating, the kind of the dichotomy between being in a self-development culture and opting for psychopharmacology.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those spaces where, two things could be true at once. Yeah. I think you touched on a really interesting point at the beginning that, the numbing was very much a response to the fact that I had deep feelings at a young age that I didn't know what to do with, and I didn't know how to process, and I didn't know how to take the wisdom out of them, how to listen to them. And so, it's really been a journey as an adult to be able to understand that my emotions are there as this incredible guide, that they have wisdom and information. And so that experience throughout my adolescence was informed by a number of different places, less so my own choosing and more so the culture and the paradigm that I was in at that time. It was certainly a lesson for me that I can look back on now and I can draw wisdom from. It was a space of time in my life that was very much one that was slightly traumatic, that was filled with simultaneously numbness and rage. But that gave me the tools, I think, to actually let me live the life that I do now and do the work that I do now.
I'm just nodding my head as I'm listening to you. I'm also thinking about, I don't know if this was an aspect of it, growing up with parents who are not mainstream, who are on the cutting edge of something different. That is a whole other kind of challenge, at least here in the United States it is. And I'm imagining it probably was for you as well, that it's like, I know my parents were very liberal. They were very progressive. They were atheists in a community of like there was a church on every block practically. And it kind of like, it really marks you as a child as being different then. Was that an experience? Was that part of your experience as well?
I think my experience as a child being different than definitely a little bit related to this. I remember being quite young and, I was exposed to like meditation practices and like, here's how you like tune in with yourself. And then like, many of my friends had like never heard of this kind of thing. It was considered very woo, 30 years ago. But I also think there were other aspects that I think I didn't fully know how to relate to other children my own age. I was always very interested in the depth. I was very interested in this idea of creativity and this idea of, well, how do we change things? How do we ask good questions at a very young age? Yes. And so it's not one thing, but there is definitely a lot of spaces where I felt out of place. Like maybe I didn't quite belong.
Yes. I right there with you. I could really identify with everything you just described a great deal. So we've talked a little bit about your background and about how your childhood and your adolescence really contributed to, and in many ways sort of has given you the gift of really being able to work with your emotions now and understand them. How did this lead you to the decision to work with the dismantling of capitalism and patriarchy?
So these times in my life gave me the tools of self-work. And I often say that I do self-work for world work, that I see self-work as a tool or as a practice that we can use, or as these wonderful modalities often teach, to use them to draw us further into the world. But, I think for a long time, I did actually reject some of these teachings, as I entered activism, as I became aware of the many, many crises that are facing us, the climate crisis being a big one that we'll talk about today.
Yeah.
I did have these questions where I was like, well, how does the law of attraction fit in with the climate crisis? If we control our own reality, if we are taught these wonderful teachings that we have agency and that we have power, right? But then where does that play into racism, into poverty, into sexism, into war? And so it took me a number of years, I think, of really holding these two realities, or these two worlds, or these two experiences of being in the world, recognizing that there are very real problems that exist. There are very real systemic and structural causes that need our attention, while also taking and learning the wisdom of spiritual teachings, of personal development teachings, and how we can use them to inform how we show up, to inform our actions. I've called my business Public Love Enterprises because I think love should be a public good, because we should look and explore love in our public spaces. And so for me, these are the bridging of the two worlds that I've really started to connect together.
I mean, you're speaking about the question that has been plaguing me since the first time I stepped into a new age healing training and got handed and it's a room full of white people, and fairly, not necessarily wealthy, but resourced enough that they could spend a couple $100 at a training for a weekend. And maybe you'd have one or two people of color there, or like people who were sort of outliers. But for the most part, it's all like cisgendered white people with resources. And I just remember, hearing you create your own reality. And when asking, well, then why are there people born with poverty? Why is there racism? Why is there so much systemic injustice? And the answer would so frequently come back, well, they chose that. And you don't understand because it's a greater magnitude of things. And if you understand the whole context, we sign these soul contracts and we do this and blah, 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 blah. And it's never landed well for me, because I'm like, yeah, that's really easy for you to say as a white person, as a person with resources, as a person with an education, as a person with privilege. But like, isn't it convenient? Like, you chose this lovely life. But what about all these people who are like, in Flint, Michigan? What about all of these people who are in Ukraine right now? What about all of these people who are like, we could just name the litany of all these people. But I love that you're talking about this, because this has in many ways been, for me, kind of like this dancing between awareness of the suffering of the world and the challenges of the world and the systemic problems. And like you were saying, the aspects of this magic and of this training that actually has merit, that has value. So I love that this is the question you're talking about.
It is, and it's a big question. And I also think there's no one single answer for it either. But I've heard so many times throughout my life that very similar rhetoric around, well, there was a soul contract and you chose this. And that also has never sat well for me either. People don't choose that. People don't choose that level of suffering. Yeah. And while I think the way I prefer to frame it is that we don't choose everything that happens to us in life. We have agency over our response. We have power in how we respond. We can certainly cultivate incredible, wisdom and space inside of us to be able to respond generatively, to be able to respond to it from a place of love and compassion with remarkable circumstances. You've seen this even from out of the Holocaust with Viktor Frankl's work and many different others. But there is still ultimately not a choice that bad things happen. Yeah. Rather, I think the depth is, rather than saying, well, we chose the bad things, it's how do we lean into the bad things? How do we learn from them? How do we love through them? How do we grow deeper, wiser, truer, more authentic through them? How do we let them stretch us as people, as humans, rather than, oh, well, they chose it. And, you just got to learn your lesson and integrate it. And then once you've learned enough, you won't experience that anymore. that feels like an incredible cop-out or a lack of responsibility.
It also feels really dissociative, in the sense that, like, I mean, I don't know, like there's a certain kind of quality of, there's also just kind of like, if somehow you master your mindset, you're not going to have a body anymore, you're not going to get sick, and you're not going to die. And there's a way in which sometimes it's just kind of like, what are you on? Just like, huh?
And I think that this idea, though, like it props up systems that cause harm in the world, right?
Yes.
I'm thinking about like a personal one right now, but there's so many examples I could give. Like, it certainly props up this idea of fat phobia. I've seen a lot in the New Age world, this idea that if you have a body that's not like this thin, slim, kind of healthy, able-bodied thing, well, then there's some kind, you can't like channel that energy all the way through you. So this idea that your spirituality is linked to the size of your body. We can look at how these systems then prop up capitalism and its need for infinite growth, its obsession with scarcity and the complete devaluation of our living body too, right? It's just about leveling up. It's just about being better. We can see how they kind of prop up messages of patriarchy and these self-shaming models because, we're falling into that same paradigm that says, well, leadership is about what you obtain. It's about what you've got. It's about how much you own. Okay, so there's so many ways that I don't think that these practices or these teachings were necessarily designed with this intention in mind.
I agree.
That they have been co-opted by systems that cause harm.
Yes. Well, and before you and I jumped on, I was commenting to you about how I'm struck within sort of the way that right now, especially in North America, the capitalization of spirituality, and particularly like, sort of like the more new age spirituality, where it's like, there's like this, the idea of success is definitely conflated with consumption and with like bling and achieving things. And I was saying to you how I'm just struck by the number of times I've heard transformational entrepreneurs, women, who are stepping into their power, talk about like one of their visions or their goals or their dreams is to be able to have access to a private jet. And to me, I'm just like for one thing, having access to a private jet, aside from the fact that I don't necessarily, if I'm going to fly somewhere, don't necessarily want to have to deal with hours in TSA, it just strikes me as like, really? Like, really? Is that what you want to use your resources for? As well as carbon footprint and all of that. But it seems like there has been such a conflation between capitalism and law of attraction and spirituality.
There absolutely is. And, I think there's a reason for this. And maybe first I might actually explain how I kind of define capitalism, because I think that might make it easier to understand. So to me, capitalism is the economic system we live in, but it's also an ideology. It's also a belief system attached to it. And there's kind of three big pillars to it. The first is that it is obsessed with growth and infinite growth on a finite planet. It is why we say it's the leading driver of the climate crisis. And it just doesn't know how to define success as anything other than growth. I think it was Edward Abbey who once said, growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell.
Yes.
And that's always struck me. The second is that it's built on this foundation of manufactured scarcity. So you can't have infinite growth without scarcity to drive that growth. So scarcity is built into the system, right? This is everything from luxury goods, the idea that, some people have it, and so we're going to make it exclusive, to planned obsolescence, the way we design so many of our computers, refrigerators, whatever it is, to die, so we have to buy another one. It's a lot of like scarcity and FOMO marketing that's like, you got to buy now, you're going to miss out. And it's also the devaluation of beautiful, living, complex systems like jungles and oceans and forests to lifeless resources, right? So my question then becomes, what happens when we live in a culture that sees these ideas and these pillars as normal, that is built on these conditions? I think we start to internalize those messages. And so I think every single one of us has this experience of internalized capitalism, which is the equation of our worth with our productivity, or our worth with what we produce. And again, then our ideas of success have to mean that we're always doing more, being more, having more. Okay. They're keeping up with the Joneses that used to be. It's now keeping up with the Kardashians, I think, but this upward class mobility. Yes. We've got this idea of like time scarcity, that there's never enough time. Okay. Like how many of us say things like, I wasted so much time, or I can squeeze a little more in, it's fine. We've got self-work, as we've been talking about, is this idea of fixing and striving and leveling up and being better, and not transformation and not healing and not self-love and self-inquiry. And so the model of capitalism has become kind of internalized in our psyches, in our relationships. Culture has become mind. And I think it's our work to kind of start to unpack this and get free from this, because it's not a conscious thing a lot of the time. It's very much unconscious. But this model and this mindset and this way of being in the world is what's leading to the climate crisis, and is what's causing so many of the struggles that we see and what we face.
Yes, yes, yes. I mean, preach. Everything you are saying, I'm just, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I want to circle back over to talking about our bodies and the relationship to our bodies. And especially, you were speaking about weight and like the ideas and the idea of like, if you do not have this perfect, thin, able body, that somehow you are less than, that somehow you're not capable of. As well as a healthy body. Like even if somebody is thin, I see this also in the idea of if you are not perfectly healthy. And like you were also speaking about the way that self-help, the way that all of the self-work has been commodified, has been co-opted into this, like, I need to crack the code and figure out like this. It's just amazing how capitalism, and I love your definition of capitalism. I agree with everything you're saying. It's just amazing. Well, and we were talking even about, you were talking about land and the relationship to space and earth and land and capitalism. And we were talking before we got on about the fact that here in the North America, you have to pay to go to the beach. Like you have to go. I mean, there's a small mountain that's like a couple miles away from where I live. If I want to go walk on that mountain, I have to pay $3 to get in, or $5 to get in.
So we've lost this sense of the commons, right? We've lost this sense of connection to land, to being human, to walking in a world that belongs to us. And instead, everything is privatized, everything is monetized, which again reinforces all of these hierarchies and exclusivity and who can afford it and who cannot.
Right.
But there is nuance in all that we're talking about, right? So because I do think personally there's a big link between emotions and physical illness and their manifestations. I've seen that myself in my own body and family.
Yes.
And it's also then not a far step when you can see that link for it to be seen or framed or understood as well, like blame. Well, like if you just just deal with yourself, just get things better, like just work on yourself, like you won't be sick. Like you've got cancer because you're too angry or whatever it might be. You're holding too much resentment. Instead of actually having the grace and the compassion and the ability to sometimes sit with what is uncomfortable, to sit with what is messy, to sit with what is hard, and to not always make it this very binary, right, wrong, good, bad, there's this, there's that, and you can like wellness your way out of any problem. That is the model of capitalism. It is the model of separation, which is the other story that underpins our world, and that says that, somehow humans are superior to everything. And that we can just use our mind to disappear somewhere else, rather than recognize that we are the natural world. We are nature, and our bodies are part of nature, and our bodies have wisdom.
Yeah. I've been working on a book that's a channeled book that is talking about what is going on with us with the planet. And one of the things that kept coming through over and over again is we ourselves in the body of this earth. And as humans, our perception of ourselves, we have been living in such a distorted perception of reality for, a couple thousand years, really. With the onset of patriarchy, the onset of empire. I'm part of a community called Way of the Rose that is all about the forgotten earth wisdom of how the rosary has the for all of the forgotten earth wisdom is encoded within it. It's community I actually think you would really love, because we're all about it. It's like the byline is ecology, not theology. But like, we lost that connection. We see, I mean, even the idea of dominion, like thinking about going back to like, the Old Testament, and this idea of, man being somehow the pinnacle who gets to name everything else and gets to define everything else, and everything is built for him. It's like, here's your toy box, use this, instead of you're part of this. There's, and as you were speaking earlier about the fact that we live in a finite closed system, and yet we're constantly pursuing growth. Like,
well, and this is the crisis that we're facing, right?
Yeah.
There's a paradigm shift that needs to happen. There is a mindset shift, a way that we see the world that needs to change. That we currently see this idea of infinite growth year on year on year on year as somehow attainable, and it's not.
Yeah.
And also somehow desirable when it's not. Like there's no actual reason for growth other than we have defined it as the only way to have success. And so I think what's interesting is rather, how do we return to what feels, like a sense of flourishing, a sense of well-being, a sense of connection, a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose? And how do we start to look at this on a collective scale in our economies to create economies that are based on care, that are based on well-being, that are based on connection to the living earth? And in our own lives, in our own bodies, to start to recognize, are we actually living lives that are meaningful to us, that are true for us?
Right.
Because if we're not, why are we doing this?
Why are we doing this? Well, and I mean, just like how the illusion that somehow growth is the goal. I mean, I cannot tell you how many times it's sort of like people are looking at, or like that if you maintained, even like as an entrepreneur, if you maintain the same amount, if you make the same amount of money this year and you make the same amount of money next year, somehow you're failing. I mean, it's like, and then also like just the things we think we want, going back to this idea of the goal of like if I can get the private access to the private jet, that I've achieved what I'm looking for. It's like, why? What is it about that do we really need? And just so much of this.
I think we as a culture have lost what it means to be satisfied or to be satiated.
Yes.
Like, we don't know what enough feels like anymore. And for me, I can see this as well in my own body. Like, I see the messages of diet culture, and I see the messages of like how I relate to food or how I relate to money, and this underpinning of scarcity, this underpinning of insecurity that permeates us, keeps us in this quest.
Yes.
And so much of this, and I think so much of like when we're really looking at, well, how do we start to even approach this idea of the climate crisis and of redesigning our communities, and of how we start to handle the mess that we're facing, is this idea of returning to what is enough, what feels good, what feels alive, what feels present. Because without that, there's no real foundation to work on.
Yeah. So how do we start finding out what is enough?
That's a good question. I think we start with our bodies, and we start with a reconnection to our bodies. I think we live incredibly neck up, and this included myself for a number of years.
Yeah.
Like I've talked earlier about, my experiences, because part of the self-work that I had to learn to do was this connection to my body. And that meant recognizing all of the places that sometimes were sore and tight and tense and had these little like niggles and these uncomfortable bits, because, when they're there, as they are for so many of us as well, we tend to check out.
Yeah.
We neck up. And that is another form of internalized capitalism. We devalue the beautiful living complex system that is our body. And so returning to what am I feeling? When I start to notice what I'm doing and how I'm acting in the decisions that I'm making, am I feeling expansive? Am I feeling lighter? Am I feeling heavier? Am I feeling closed? What is coming up for me right now? Does it have a shape? Does it have a color? Where does it live? Like, without this sense of really starting to know what is it in me that feels enough. And this is interesting, because I often refer to this work as, well, starting to follow what feels good as well, right? That this should feel pleasurable, it should feel good. But that doesn't mean it's always comfortable. This is often deeply uncomfortable work for us at first to start to even notice what's there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and especially when we are so accustomed to dissociating from our body, ignoring our body. I mean, we've been taught to see our body as tools. And even the relationship between in sort of the theological idea of body and soul being separated, body and spirit being separated, that somehow there's the real me and then there's my body. And, we are so divorced from it. The last night, as we're talking, I'm thinking about a couple of different things. One thing, I was having a conversation with a group of people last night, and we were having a deep dive on a lot of what you and I are talking about right now. And somebody referred to their relationship with spirit, with divine, with their spirituality as having an insecure attachment disorder, or having insecure attachment to God. Or to, in the case of our world, Mother Earth and the Blessed Mother, we were more talking about the divine feminine, but the insecure attachment to the divine feminine. And I'm thinking, as a species, we have an insecure attachment to our planet.
Oh, right. Don't we?
Don't we? I mean, we're so, and it's and if you think about the definition of, or the idea of clinically an insecure attachment, how we behave when we have insecure attachment, we are insecure, we are anxious, we are worried, we are constantly looking at the scarcity, we are constantly striving, we're constantly trying to get that attention, that attachment. And in so many ways, it's we have this as a species, we have this insecure attachment to the earth, entirely driven by ourselves, but still it's so potent.
It is. And, there's so many spaces that I think we need to start to look at here. One is definitely this area of reimagination and envisioning and creativity and generativity that I'm sure we can return to. But, when we're talking about our attachment to the earth, I think the very first thing is also in actually recognizing that we are part of this earth.
Yes, we are.
That we are humans, we are part of the natural world, we are an animal. And in the same way that I think, right now we are living through the sixth mass extinction. We are seeing species go extinct at a rate that is unimaginable. Yeah. And we know that so many species in the world have this sense within them that allows them to pick up that something is happening, whether it's weather patterns, whether it's danger, whether it's this idea, well, I should travel further or I should migrate this distance. There is an innate knowing within them and an innate connection. And we sometimes think that that doesn't exist within humans. Right, that somehow we're a bit separate. We're just this neck up, head-based creature. Right. We're just logical and rationality.
Right.
And I think that actually we are all feeling what's happening in the earth right now.
Yes.
And so when we have this insecure attachment, I think we're probably also a bit well, it also hurts to go there. It hurts to be attached. It's painful because we know in our bodies that something isn't right now.
Yes. Yes. Well, and it's, I talk about, as empaths, I talk about how, we feel the rumble under our feet, that a lot of times when something's coming, we can sense it, we can feel it. And that empaths often experience it as feeling that panic. But I think so many of us right now, whether you identify as an empath or not, I believe that we as a species are awakening to our sensitivity. We are awakening to our interconnection, and we are starting to feel things that we don't want to feel. And a lot of people are I'm an empath and it's really hard. But part of it is we are evolving as a species into remembering what we are. Cells in the body. I believe humans are kind of like the nerve cells in the body, that we're part of the neural net. That we have a capacity to process a great deal of information. But right now, it is incredibly uncomfortable because things are so, I don't know if you ever saw the movie Koyaanisqatsi. It came out, it's exquisite. No. It was, check it out. It came out in the 80s, and it's all about, Koyaanisqatsi is a Native American term for life out of balance. And it is this exquisitely beautiful photo montage with music by Philip Glass of the earth and what's going on in this earth. And it's beautiful, but it's also terrifying. And, and it was just it's this exquisite art piece about what we're doing to the planet. But it's like that feeling, it's almost inevitable that we will feel that fear. We will feel that terror. It's because of what's happening.
And we need to feel that, though. And that's the hard thing here. Like,
it is.
I really, especially like living in North America, especially, it's become incredibly aware, like how desensitized we are to the world around us, that we walk past people who are struggling on the street every single day as if it's nothing, that we walk past through our cities, that have, no sense of life in them, as if that's somehow normal.
Yeah.
And I've started to wonder, throughout all of this and throughout my own reckoning with the climate crisis and both the troubles and the possibilities that lie in this time, whether extinction can be a form of memory. In the same way that death and grief teaches us what we love, it teaches us what matters, it gives us a sense or an anchor of this is what is important in my life. Whether the extinction events that we are experiencing on this planet can start to serve us as a form of memory, returning us to what matters as a species, as humanity, as to what we love and who and how we want to be in this world.
What I'm wondering is that you're saying a form of memory. I'm wondering, is it also like a form of priority, a form of urgency, a form of perspective? Like,
I think a returning. I think a returning to what actually matters, because I think innately, I think most of us know that the world as it is not serving us. It's not
serving us. Right.
Even when you have a degree of privilege within this society and a degree of you're doing okay, there's often a sense of burnout, a sense of exhaustion, a sense of insecurity, a sense that it could all collapse at any moment. And then this question of, well, why am I doing any of this?
Right.
And so it's really, the memory is about, hey, this is true. This is what feels right to me. This is what matters. Oh, this is home. This is my body. This is the world that I inhabit. This is the love that I can bring. This is the calling that I have deep inside of me. And this is, I think, the message and the wonder that we can potentially start to tap into in this time, but only through our connections to feelings.
Yes. So you talked about how uncomfortable it can be. How do we navigate that? How do we surrender to the discomfort? Like, what are the baby steps?
Oh, I think that the hardest and the simplest thing is that it is first and foremost a willingness. It is a willingness and a capacity to be vulnerable. And that takes practice. I think sometimes with all of this work of orienting to our inner compass, with any work of getting free and really challenging the mindset of systems, with any work of starting to say, hey, actually, this feels right to me, even though perhaps culture and family, say like, this is crazy. Why would you do this? It's going to take practice. There's never a one-time moment that it's like done. It's over. I'm liberated. I'm enlightened. I've gone down the river. I've bathed and I am free. I wish it was. We all kind of know those aha moments, but we can't manufacture them. And so it is in the small day-by-day, moment-by-moment practice situations that we have to actually kind of just turn towards ourselves to say, hey, what am I feeling? Do I have space to check in with this right now? If I don't, can I work with somebody who can help me check in with this, who can help me hold this or navigate this? And that's the practice, because without that, I think it's kind of like we're just waiting for something else to happen.
Well, and this goes back to the concepts of and the way that spirituality and the whole personal development movement has been so conflated with capitalism and commodified, that we are always looking for that aha moment. We're always looking for that big revelatory, like pivotal transformation. We don't necessarily, and I mean, thinking about like, just like you pay X $1,000 to go to this weekend with the guru and have this like life-changing transformation. And yet I concur completely that it's like the real change is gradual. It's incremental. It's like a little teeny tiny piece at a time where, it's just like one little bite at a time that we're working on it, not this pivotal transformation. And yet again, it's this idea of on-off switch of capitalism.
Right. And, there's nothing wrong with like desiring things or wanting things, you know, and actually, I want to make a small disclaimer that like, capitalism is not the same thing as money. Capitalism is not the same thing as business. It is perfectly okay to want to live a flourishing, thriving life. I think we all should. But when we think that it's always about these big moments, it's always about, I've just got to get the next thing and have more and have a bigger house and always got to work with that teacher now because they're the best. They're the ones that will help me get there. It's a lot sexier, right? To kind of follow this path. And it's a very glamorous in a sense. You can always be like, yeah, I'm doing this now and I'm working on myself. But it's not necessarily foundational or honest or authentic. Right. And so that is the space that we're always returning to and looking for.
The other thing that I have seen, because I've been around the, transformational healing and coaching world for a really long time. The other thing that I see is a lot of people trying to follow the formulas and trying to do the things that they're being told is going to create the results. And it's not. And so then they end up feeling like a failure and they feel like they must, because they've been told, oh, it's your energy, it's your mindset, it's your attitude, it's your this, it's your that if only they can just tweak themselves and adjust themselves, then somehow they would be able to buy the bigger house. They would be able to 10x their business. They'd have 10, 20, 30,000, $100,000 months. Like all of these ways that there's this, and the metric of success. But what I've seen over and over and over and over again, because I've been under the hood with a lot of transformational entrepreneurs, I've been, like the fairy godmother to fairy godmothers for a long time. What I will say is that a lot of this stuff doesn't add up when you actually talk to people about what's really going on in their life. And yet what I see instead is just this level of, increased level of anxiety, increased level of paranoia, increased level of feeling like I don't have it figured out because I'm not doing XYZ, instead of the grace of love and just like, would it be like to let the soft animal of our body love what it loves, to quote Mary Oliver.
Mary Oliver.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I think we live in a world that loves to frame systemic problems as individual problems,
yes,
or to give individual solutions to systemic problems, right? And it's so much easier because we can say, well, the problem isn't the entire system and the way that it's organized. And remembering systems always have a story. They always have a mindset. They always play out in us, as us, and through us. But it's a lot easier to say, no, it's you. Okay, you're the problem. And I'm going to give a potentially controversial example here as a living in North America, but coming from a different culture. One of the easiest examples that I can see partly is this idea of tipping culture. This idea, well, it's rather than fixing what is a systemic problem, that there is no living wage, that there is no decent minimum wage that people can survive on. Well, then it's up to every individual who comes into contact with this server to therefore pay extra to make sure that they're supported.
Yes.
Okay. It's a system problem that we're giving individual solutions to. And we do the same thing with whether it's racism, sexism, this idea of the meritocracy that, well, if you just work hard enough, you'll get there. It's fine. Like the structures that you live in and that inform your life don't have any sort of influence so that you can overcome them. We love a great underdog story, don't we?
Oh.
And so rather what I'm interested in is not blaming the system, not saying, well, partly blaming the system, but not being powerless in response to the system, not saying, well, it's all bad and I can't do anything, but finding this sweet spot in the middle that says, hey, you know what, this system, this is deeply problematic. What is the story of this system? How am I maybe interacting with it? How am I perpetrating it? How can I start to get free of it? Where does my own agency, my own desire, my own power lies? And so it's a little subtle shift that turns it away from just you're the problem, fix yourself and you'll be great. And rather, oh, actually, I'm human in a very messy world, in a very toxic world. And how can I start to be part of its remaking and also live my own authentic life in the process?
Laura, we're at 14 minutes before we hit the mark in terms of the goal of being done with this show and this episode. And this conversation, I could talk with you for hours, but you just, so how do we start Could you speak from your own personal experience? Like, what are you doing?
I think each and every one of us needs to live lives that is true for us. And I've said this throughout. I have often said that for me, I identify as queer, and queerness has been part of my compass. And I think everyone has this compass. It's just that queerness taught it to me. Mm-hmm. But it taught me the ability to be able to say, you know what? No, this feels right. This feels good. This feels like what I want. Even when everything in my life kind of said, no, you're not supposed to want that. No, that doesn't feel right. No, you're not supposed to go there. Like, that's not appropriate, or whatever it might be. And so it was a process for me of having that inbuilt compass, of learning not to trust it and then learning to retrust it. And I think that is something that each and every single one of us needs to do, because we all have that compass in different ways. We all have that one thing that we have loved. We all have that one thing that keeps coming to the back of our minds going, yeah, but you could do this thing. And then we never really go there. We all have callings. And so I think when I'm asking what we can do, it is in following those callings, because especially in the age of climate change, especially with the severity and the urgency and the level of the crises that we face, which I cannot understate, the deepest, most meaningful response that you can have in this time will always come from your truest, most meaningful self. It's going to come from those callings, from those little voices. And so listen to them, honor them, cultivate them. That is where the magic is.
Yes. 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 You spoke about the learning to trust your inner compass again. I'm imagining there is a process, or that there was like, what was that like to first give that, like to honor that compass again? Like,
well, I think, when I'm looking again, like at the numbing response that I had for so many years, so much of that as well was shutting off from my inner compass. It was turning away from it and going, you can't trust that. You can't trust yourself. And so many of us carry this story that somehow we are untrustworthy, that we can't be trusted with our own business. We can't be trusted with our ideas, with our vision, with our dreams, that will somehow mess something up along the way, or we're not good enough. And so learning to trust that inner compass, I think, is really learning to be a steward of our own power, right? It's learning to actually have a little bit of audacity, have a little bit of courage, being willing to take risks, being willing to fail. Yeah. And that's incredibly hard, because we do not live in a culture that says it's okay for you to fail, particularly women. Right. It's not okay for women to fail in this culture.
Right.
But we need more of us developing that systemic analysis and that ability to look outward, that ability to say, hey, yeah, it's not okay to fail here, but, excuse my language, like, F that's not going to work. I'm going to do something different. And so it's a process. I think it's a journey. I think our compass never points in the same direction all of the time, unfortunately. And it's a constant recalibration that comes from this sense of, I trust my body. I trust myself.
Well, and if our compasses are calibrating us to the earth, and the earth is in constant flux, then it makes complete sense that we are going to be learning how to listen to the compass and follow it in different directions. You also said something that just really made me think about, like, the idea of we cannot trust ourselves, we cannot trust our compass. This is, this goes back to the conversation about weight and about women and food. Like, there is such a profound cultural idea that women cannot trust themselves with food. Left to our own devices, we are all going to be these fat, undesirable cows that, somehow do not meet the needs of the patriarchy. But it's like, how deeply ingrained is this concept that we cannot trust ourselves? And I mean,
we can't trust ourselves with money either.
We can't trust ourselves with money, it's everything. With money, with clothing, with sex. I mean, just nothing. We cannot trust ourselves.
Which is a point maybe to make, actually. I think part of where this stems from, in part, I think there's many places, is the idea of patriarchy that you've touched on. Patriarchy is a system that leverages shame for power. And that is how it wields power. Oof. It does this in magazines, it does this in meeting rooms, it does this through the idea of mansplaining, because, you wouldn't know this, would you? Who are you to know this? Right. There's a reason that women disproportionately suffer imposter syndrome and perfectionism and doubt themselves. And so it makes a lot of sense when you live in a culture that continually soft shames women, that you, as a woman, or any minority, I will say,
Yes.
will not trust themselves.
Yes. 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 Well, and I was talking with my mentee earlier about, like, she has ancestors who were slaves from Africa. And we were talking about one of the myths of the idea of the lazy slave, and how really the truth is they're exhausted. They're not lazy, they're exhausted. But just the internalization of all of these, like this, just, and I love how you were speaking of patriarchy, like the using shaming and using humiliation as this way to perpetrate and perpetuate and to just sustain a system that is so not life affirming.
And that's why I think so much of this, we can start to use self-work as a radical act. We can start to use spirituality, of these inner practices, right? Of trusting ourselves, of listening to ourselves, of honoring our bodies as forms of revolution. I think these are necessary for the revolution, because the systems that make our world, the systems that are driving the climate crisis, are systems that fundamentally cannot survive these practices. They shame them, they turn away from them, they kind of make them seem fringe or woo or bad for a reason. Yeah. There's a reason capitalism co-opts everything too, because it's like a virus just trying to survive. Okay. Yes. So it's just going to take the next thing and the next thing. And so our work is always in understanding the story of a system. And when we can understand the story, we have the capacity to get free and to change it from the inside out.
Ah, preach. Laura has generously agreed to spend a little bit of time talking with us about real practical steps and solutions that we can take that can help in this time of climate crisis and sixth wave of extinction that's going on right now.
So first of all, it's very easy with the climate crisis to think, but the problem's so big, right? Like, what am I supposed to do? There's nothing we can do. We can't survive like this, like we can't disrupt capitalism or like, just end fossil fuels or anything. There is so much that we can do. Okay, I really want to say that. And that is both as individuals and collectively, because I think it's really important that we start to act collectively. On an individual level, if you're looking for things to do, I would start with some of the simplest but most powerful actions. The first is divest. Take your money out of banks, out of pension funds, out of any sort of investment that is investing in fossil fuels. And this is really common. Most of the big banks still do this. If you Google ethical banking, you will come up with solutions for your area. Move your money out. That is first and foremost. Secondly, this is it's a slightly more difficult one depending where we are, but eat less meat and dairy. The beef industry accounts for about 18% of the emissions that we face. So we need to eat less meat and dairy. And I'm not going to say go completely vegan, but I am going to say eat local, eat less meat and dairy. And if you must eat meat, try to source it that's been farmed regeneratively from a local regenerative farm.
Yes. Yes. Because I was going to say, the other side of it is eat locally and know your farmers and get food from, instead of factory farms, like get your, and I live in a state where I have the luxury of we have the oldest organic farmers and gardeners association on the entire country. And so it's a value that we have here. So I really have access to that. But I'm sure, especially if you're talking about people in cities, access to local meat, access to local dairy, access to local eggs is much harder.
Also, the costs sometimes associated with like regenerative farming, when you're taking like really well sourced and really well cared for beef, it is a higher cost.
It is a much higher cost. Yes.
And so I have the both and there that I think it is a reduction. And it's then when you do have it, try and source it from somewhere that is sustainable and local.
Yes. Well, and this also goes into even within our consumption, our portion consumption as a culture. We have this, it's sort of like we want to eat steaks that are as big as our head, when really, depending on the size of an adult, you need somewhere between probably like 3 to 6, maybe 8 ounces tops but really 3 to 6 ounces of animal protein. Is
goes into the palm of your hand. Exactly.
Right. Exactly. It's like a playing card. That's adequate. Yeah.
Right. And so we need to kind of, and this is that thing of like getting used to, like, or getting comfortable with things that are kind of uncomfortable, because it can feel kind of weird at first, but still, this is a necessity that I think that we face.
Yeah.
I think we also need to start acting collectively, right? And this might mean there are so many different ways we can do this. One, you can join a movement. There are disruptive movements like Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, Greenpeace do a bit as well, but, certainly for an everyday movement you can join. If you Google some of these, or the Sunrise Movement, you've got some great, like, direct action groups that are out there that are really rooted in nonviolence, that are rooted in somewhat spiritual principles as well of how can we do things differently and disrupt this system. I would also say, though, work locally, right? Work at the level, some of the most powerful places that we have influence is our local council.
Yes.
Okay. Ask our local council to declare a climate emergency. What would it actually mean if there was a climate emergency? Would there be more cycle lanes? Would there, what's the kind of treatment of plastics? Are there kind of incentives for people to get solar panels and retrofit their homes? And then last thing I would say, and this is if it interests you, I think democracy as it exists is somewhat broken. I think it is failing us. And that doesn't mean that, democracy is like gone forever and we can never reclaim it. I think we can. But we need to look into these ideas like citizens' assemblies. Citizens' assemblies have been used in Ireland, in France, in many countries around the world to bring local people together, to bring diverse constituents together, to discuss the big issues, that believes that people, when they are given the right information, the right tools, and the right amount of power, can make good decisions for their communities. So Google citizens' assemblies, start to look at, hey, what would this actually look like? Are there any movements in my country, in my neighborhood, in my state that are campaigning to get this more? I know in Canada there is a movement for this. I am sure there is across the US. So let's look at all of these levels: individual, collective, local council level. What do we need? How can we start to retrofit and prepare ourselves? And then also, hey, democracy. Let's do something about this.
Well, and in terms of, two things come to my mind in terms of democracy and community action. One is, here in Maine, we actually have ranked choice voting for many things other than national election levels. And so just reforming and changing voting, like asking for and petitioning for ranked choice voting across the country, where we stop getting gridlocked and bipartisanship. This is huge. This would make a big difference. The other thing that comes to my mind is, like, I live in a very small town and we have an extremely contentious government. There's a lot of back and forth. And ironically, I often find that it's the old guard, white conservative men who I agree with more, because they're less invested in, they don't want to do all of this, like, building up of the downtown and impacting our aquifer and like just growing things. So the irony is, it's like upside down world in my tiny little town, because it's actually generally the Republican, the old guard, that want to protect our resource, our land and our water. And ironically, the young liberals who are looking at, like, developing the downtown, building more buildings, growing the school, doing all of these different things. But what's happened in our town is that there's a lot of contentiousness. There's a lot of divisiveness. And so what also comes to my mind is we need to learn how to communicate with each other again. We need to learn how to have nonviolent communication. We need to learn how to express our feelings and talk about something and disagree with people without slamming people. Because, I've lived in this town for over 20 years and never have I seen the contentiousness and the viciousness that has recently arisen. And I think because of what's happening with the climate crisis and the way that it's affecting all of us unconsciously, we're feeling this. It seems to me that a lot of people have really lost the skill in knowing how to show up for a conversation and say, I disagree with you, but I'd like to find a solution that works for all of us. So I would say such a nonviolent communication, learn how to communicate.
I very much agree with you. I think this idea that somehow, this hyper-partisanship, there's no middle ground anymore, is a space that we need to learn to bridge.
Yes.
You know, I sometimes use this term that, you know, we're change makers or we're cultural wayfinders, moving from the world as it is to the world as it could be. But in that moving between the two worlds, we need to be able to communicate. We need to be able to have disagreement. We need to be able to be in relationship with people who have very different opinions to ourselves. And that doesn't mean we have to agree with them. Doesn't mean we have to tolerate abuse or uphold any sort of standard that is like unjust. But it does mean that we need to be able to have the capacity to still hold conversations, to still be together.
To be able to behold the inherent worth and dignity in every human being and see them as human instead of the way that we've been demonizing each other, you know, and just especially here in the United States during the COVID pandemic, it was so us and them. There was just such an incredible separation. It's been heartbreaking to look at the way that that the United States has just been ripped in half or divided and shredded by this idea of this person is not, like, we've lost our humanity or perceiving humanity in each other, which is just so sad.
It is.
Yeah.
And so this is space that we need to do. Like, all of this is climate work, right? Yeah. Climate work is not just about emissions. It's not just about making everything electric and continuing on with the same path. It won't work. Okay. Mm-hmm. We can't just everyone have electric cars and life just goes on. It's not the answer.
No.
But we need to have this deep kind of reassessment of what does it mean to be human? How do we want to be with each other? What does it mean for our lives to have meanings and for us to all to live a good life? And so this is a good life together. So use this space to come back into community, back into relationship. And we need to galvanize people, even people who don't think climate is real or don't see it as urgent or important.
Yeah. Yeah. So incredibly important. And, you know, and what also comes to my mind, and this is one of sort of, you know, one of my soapboxes, is I also believe very strongly that we need to deal with our ancestral inherited trauma. We need to deal with all of the things that cause us to react, that get us triggered, that put us in a position where we feel nothing but despair and helplessness and powerlessness. And we need to deal with that. Because and that may be for some of us is where we start, is just by dealing with the inherited trauma, by dealing with the patterns and the beliefs and the things that keep us spinning our wheels and stuck. And I'm also thinking, as I'm listening to you, granting ourselves grace, granting ourselves mercy. It's not going to be perfect.
Oh my gosh, right? Like, there's so often this idea, if you're an environmentalist, that you have to be so perfect. And I used to hold this myself. I used to feel like so guilty whenever I used like a takeaway coffee cup, which was like, I tried never to, and I still try never to, you know, but like, or I like had a bit of plastic, or I couldn't recycle something, and it felt like this weight on my shoulders.
Yep.
And it's like, no, I can tell you right now, there is no amount of like single-use coffee cups or plastic that is like literally causing the level of climate crisis that there is. Okay. There is so much bigger than that. It is a system problem. And like we were talking about before, we have been gaslit to believe that it's an individual problem, that you just reduce your carbon footprint and it'll be fine and it's all you. It's not. It's the system. So hand that back to where it belongs and act collectively and organize.
Yeah. Any last thoughts before I let you go again?
I think not. I think, you know, my only last piece of advice, if people are really looking for something to do with the climate movement, and always feel free to message me and to reach out to me if you're wanting to figure this out, because this is what I do and I help people find their path, is there is a wonderful movement out of the UK called Transition Towns, which really looks at this local movement and this hyper-localization of how can we prepare our towns, ready our towns, but in a way that allows for their flourishing, for them actually to thrive through this time. So Google them, check them out, and do what feels right for you.
Laura, I really could talk with you for hours. It is just such a breath of fresh air and sweet, sweet water to my soul to talk about this with you. And we have come to that point. So I got 3 questions for you. First one is there anything else that feels really important to share? You'd just kick yourself if you didn't say it.
We live in a time that requires a radical reimagination of everything. And I mean everything, our accounting systems, our agriculture, our energy, our transportation. There's not a single industry that doesn't need some sort of transformation.
Yeah.
Use your life to vision what is possible, to dream what is possible, to seed it into reality. There is no time to sit on the sidelines anymore. There is no time to keep waiting for someone else. That is my message. Vision the world. It is yours to create.
So now we're going to do one of the things that I always love to do at the end of every session. And that is because I believe podcasts exist in perpetuity and they exist outside of time. This is being recorded. We're recording it in the autumn. It's probably going to be airing sometime later. And it's going to live on servers for a while and people will hear this, hopefully for many, many years to come. I also believe there's a way in which we drop this broadcast like a stone into the water and it ripples out in time to the other side too. And so what I always love to do is think about, we have the capacity to send a broadcast message back to younger Laura. We have a capacity to give her something she really needs. And so my question to you is what, when, who are we going back to? And what are you telling her? What will you, and this is where you really literally tell her, don't say, I would say to her, but speak to her. Let's give her a message that she needs.
Gosh, I'm going to go back to 7-year-old Laura. And I'm going to say, it's okay to be who you are and it's okay to feel what you feel.
It's okay to be who you are and it's okay to feel what you feel. I'm also hearing, and your feelings are just right sized. I know they may feel like big feelings for you as a 7-year-old, and your feelings are perfect. Your feelings are good. Your feelings are right.
I hear that and I receive that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, Laura, this conversation has just been so yummy, so delicious, so good. Oh, and I really love, one of the things I'm really taking away from this is it's like every one of us has an inner compass. I believe, it's like in Way of the Rose, we talk about it as our heart's desire, that every one of us has a heart's desire that is leading us towards our salvation, that is leading us towards the path. I sincerely doubt it's having a private jet. But hey, maybe for somebody it is. But, every one of us has that heart's desire. Every one of us has that inner compass. And what I'm really hearing, and it's interesting because this really tracks with the messages within Way of the Rose community, is that the way through is by re-embracing and reclaiming our heart's desire and our inner compass. And I'm also just really hearing you say, it's like, tune into that inner compass, follow the pull, follow the urge, follow the desire that you're being called to, and re-envision the world. Like what could it look like?
Exactly. Reimagine the world, reimagine everything.
Yeah.
Like we have the power to do that. The whole world was made by our imagination. And most of the time by the imagination of people who really didn't think about our well-being, who didn't think about us. And so why not use the generativity, the creativity, the energy that we have to be part of its remaking? I think that's the deepest thing that we can do in being alive in this time.
Okay, last question. How did people get in touch with you?
My website is laurahartley.com. I'm also on Instagram at laura.h.hartley, and I'm also on LinkedIn if that's your space.
Awesome. Okay, so laura.h.hartley on Instagram, also over on LinkedIn and laurahartley.com. Also, if you guys are listening and you're out and about in the world and you just want to come back over to the show notes, empathicmasteryshow.com, and we will have all the links for Laura's wonderful, wonderful resources and things and stuff so that you can go find Laura, go make a connection with her, tell her that you found her here, tell her that you think she's awesome, and learn more. Laura, Thank you so much. This really has been delightful.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to be here, and it was a joy to have this conversation. I so appreciate it.
As we come to the end of this episode, I'd love to hear what you're taking from this show. Please jump over to empathicmasteryshow.com to leave your comments. In the show notes, you'll find a link to grab your copy of my Empathic Safety Guide, 3 Basics for Finding Calm in the Eye of the Storm. And while you're there, please subscribe and follow this show. And thank you for your help sharing this show with the people who need it. Please help me to spread the word and send this podcast to friends or family members who need support living as highly sensitive empathic people. Then join me again when the next Empathic Mastery Show airs. Okay, one last time. Hop over to empathicmasteryshow.com for your Empathic Safety Guide. And until next show, shine on. We need you and your gifts here on this planet. So please don't judge your empathic rainbow by colorblind standards.